I have pressed the participant list or the record button, so we are recording. Okay, and you should be seeing the shared screen that says Absolute Advantage. All right, let's remember what we have been talking about. So far this semester, we said everything begins with scarcity. We don't have enough resources to produce all the things we'd like to have, so we have to somehow figure out how to deal with that problem. And we talked last time about some of the things we can do to make our situation better. We don't just have to just accept whatever's physically present with us and just live on that. We can do things to make our situation better. And first we said, well, trade. Even if we're not producing new things, because preferences vary. One person doesn't put much value on a certain thing and another person does. They can trade and they both benefit. On my office door, I have a comic that it says the birth of free market economics, and you got two guys who look like Stone Age people. One of them's holding a stick, one of them's holding a rock. The one with the stick is thinking, I wish I had a rock. And the one who's holding a rock is thinking, I wish I had a stick. Okay? So they're not producing anything, but if they trade, they're both getting what they want. And so they're both benefiting. Value is being created by trade, even when no new physical things are being produced. But we said that we can also make ourselves better off and make other people better off through specialization and then trade. We gave a couple of reasons why specialization is useful. We said the division of knowledge. As you specialize and you focus on doing the same thing over and over and over, you get better and better at it. The knowledge that's available for producing that good or that service grows. And as other people are specializing in other things, then they're acquiring new knowledge that's different from the knowledge you're acquiring. And if we're all specializing in different things, then everybody's getting more and more knowledge, and we all get to benefit, not just from the knowledge we have, but I get to benefit from the knowledge that you're acquiring and that everybody else is acquiring. And this is a powerful way that societies and individuals benefit. We are dramatically better off than most people in the past, not by accident, but because of largely because of the benefits of specialization and trade. That's not the only thing. We'll be talking about other things, but these are really, really important causes of the progress that we are enjoying today. We also said that when we have specialization, then we end up producing a larger quantity of things. If you're producing bread for your family, you don't produce very much. If you're specializing in producing bread, you're going to produce a lot. And if you're going to produce a lot, then you can consider production methods that wouldn't make any sense if you were only producing a small quantity. You can buy an oven that is going to produce 1,000 loaves a day at a very low per unit cost because you're going to trade them to other people. And other people can do the same thing. As we specialize, as we trade, then we become better off, other people become better off. Specialization in trade historically has been the path toward prosperity. And at the very end of class on Tuesday, we started talking about the idea of comparative advantage. We know that we are not all clones of each other. We differ in terms of our abilities. And because of those differences, because of the diversity in our abilities, we can make use of those differences to make us all better off. We said that there's going to be an important distinction between two terms that sound very familiar: absolute advantage, comparative advantage. Absolute advantage, as you see on the screen, is the ability to produce the same good using fewer inputs than another producer. So if we're talking about producing cars, well, a country or company that can produce a car with fewer resources has an absolute advantage over another company or another country. Right? You can produce the product with fewer resources, you have an absolute advantage. And absolute advantage is extremely important. If you have an absolute advantage in producing things, then you're going to be better off. You're going to be more prosperous because you can produce more. But when we start to think about what should you produce or what should a particular country produce, okay? Absolute advantage is not what is most important. Okay? It's a different concept that's important. It's comparative advantage. Okay, we started going through an example. We were assuming just two countries, just two goods, and only one type of resource, and that was labor. Two goods were computers and shirts. And we made the assumption, stop for a second. In this class, it's extremely important when I say, let's assume. Okay, that should be a warning to pay close attention to what we're assuming. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had students come up and they're just really frustrated. They say, I cannot figure out how you got this. How did you know such and such was true? And I say, well, I don't. I just assumed that it was true. Often in our examples, we have to start with some assumptions, and then we draw conclusions based on those assumptions. And if you don't notice the difference between the conclusions we're reaching and the assumptions we're making, then you get really, really frustrated, and your studying is going to be very frustrating, not very productive. So when you hear that word, let's assume, pay close attention to what we are assuming. Okay? So we are assuming that in Mexico, to produce computers takes 12 units of labor. The U.S. only takes 1. We're assuming that to produce shirts takes 2 units of labor in Mexico. In the United States, it only takes 1. So who has the absolute advantage in computers? The United States, because for computers, let's see, we only have to use 1 unit of labor to produce a computer. Mexico, it takes 12. Okay? For shirts, it's going to be the same thing. The United States has a comparative advantage in terms of our assumptions. Okay? Now, don't say, but no, that's not really true. It doesn't take that much labor in Mexico. These are assumptions. We're not saying that this is the actual amount of the resource that it takes. We're saying we're creating a very simple situation so that we can draw some conclusions and we can learn some important lessons. Economics is sometimes criticized for making lots of assumptions. So it's important to understand why we make assumptions. If we don't make assumptions, if we deal with all the complexity of the world all at once, our examples are going to be so complicated, we won't be able to figure anything out. We won't be able to understand what's going on. Okay? We make the assumptions so that in a very simple situation, we can see, draw a conclusion. We can learn a truth or see a principle. Okay? And then once we understand that principle in a very simple situation, we can then take it and apply it in a more realistic situation. Economic analysis would be totally useless if it only works with simple situations. Okay? The principles we derive work in the real world, okay? But we simplify to make it easier for you to understand those principles, which you can then use in looking at real world situations. And comparative advantage is an idea that we're simplifying a lot here, but the conclusion we're going to draw is extremely important. Much of the progress that countries have had over the centuries has been due to allowing the law of comparative advantage to work. And we'll see how that works in just a minute. Okay? So what we've seen here is that the U.S. has an absolute advantage in both goods, and that absolutely can happen. Okay? Another footnote here, we can apply what we're talking about to two countries, we can apply it to two companies, we can apply it to two individuals. So it's a very, it's a concept that we can apply at lots of different levels. What we see here is that it is possible for one country to have an absolute advantage in everything, and the other country to have an absolute advantage in nothing. Right? That can definitely happen. Or you can have one country has an absolute advantage in one, and the other has the absolute advantage in the other good. Anything can happen with absolute advantage. But what is important in determining trade patterns is not absolute advantage. What is important is comparative advantage. Comparative advantage refers to producing goods at the lowest opportunity cost. And it may not be obvious what's the difference. If you can produce a good with fewer resources, doesn't that mean you can produce it at the lowest opportunity cost? That sounds plausible, but it's not true. Okay? Think about what opportunity cost is. Your book and Sapling has given you a good bit of information about that. Opportunity cost refers to what you give up when you choose to produce something or you choose to purchase something. So go back to the example in the book of Martha Stewart and her assistant. It said that Martha Stewart is probably really good at ironing. We'll assume she's really good at ironing. She's probably better than her assistant. And we know she's really good at running her business because she created from nothing probably $1 billion business. And her assistant probably isn't very good at that. Okay? The question then was, well, since Martha Stewart has an absolute advantage at everything, can she benefit from employing an assistant? Is she employing the assistant just because it helps the assistant? Or can the person with an absolute advantage in everything benefit from trading with somebody who's not as good as they are? And the conclusion is Martha Stewart can benefit from hiring the assistant. The assistant is not as good at anything. But what is important is comparative advantage. Martha Stewart, when she irons, she can do it faster than her assistant can. But what's important is, what does Martha Stewart give up when she irons? If she spends, takes her an hour to do a certain amount of ironing, she could have been spending that time running her business, making decisions. Okay? And because she's very good at that, if she takes an hour away from running her business, the cost of that is likely to be very high. Okay? Whereas her assistant, when she irons a certain piece of clothing, opportunity cost isn't going to be that high, because if the assistant had been running the business, she's not very good at that. Okay? The opportunity cost to the assistant ironing is very low. The opportunity cost to Martha Stewart of ironing is very high. The law of comparative advantage says if everybody, every country, every person specializes in the good at which they have a comparative advantage, and then they trade, then everybody will benefit. The country that doesn't have an absolute advantage in anything, they will benefit. But so will the country that has an absolute advantage in everything. Trade is mutually beneficial, even when it's between two parties where one is clearly better at everything than the other one is. That's the idea. Now, to illustrate that a little more carefully, we're going to develop what is called a production possibilities frontier. It's a very useful framework for thinking about trade and production. And here we're adding an additional assumption. We're starting with the information we assumed before. Now we're assuming that each country has 24 units of labor. Okay? Mexico and the United States, same amount of labor, but the amount they can produce with that labor is going to be differ significantly. Okay? Because in the United States, since the computers only require 1 unit of labor, they're going to be able to produce 24 computers. Whereas in, that's right. Yeah. Whereas in Mexico, if they devote everything to computers, they're not going to be able to produce nearly as much because each computer requires much more labor. So, production frontier is going to show us the options for each country. Okay, notice this is on the left, this is for Mexico. On the right, this is for the United States. Anytime, this is a really important point to remember, anytime you're looking at a graph, pay very close attention to it. A lot of people have trouble with graphs, and it's generally because they're not really looking at it closely. I'll talk to students who are having trouble with the graph, and I don't understand anything about it. I say, okay, what's the variable on the horizontal axis? And they'll say, I don't know. Well, look at it, and you'll see it listed there. It's just a matter of looking at it and observing. If you don't like graphs, then you have to look at it for longer. But eventually you'll start to see. It's kind of like you go into a dark, you've been outside in the bright sunlight, and you go inside into a room that doesn't have much light. Can you see very much? No, your eyes have not adjusted. You have to be in the room for a while for your eyes to adjust, and you gradually start to see things. It's very similar with graphs, that when you first look at a graph, especially if you don't like them, you look at it, it doesn't make any sense to you. You have to stare at it for a while, and you say, okay, well, look at everything on the graph. What's it referring to? Well, this is referring to Mexico, this is referring to the US. Then you look at what is the variable on each axis. This is the quantity of shirts that can be produced in Mexico. This is the quantity of computers. Over here, quantity of shirts, quantity of computers in the United States. So you just spend time absorbing what you see on the graph. And if you do that, things that just seem hopelessly impossible, you'll say, well, it's not really that complicated. For Mexico, okay, we'll generally be interested in the endpoints, the intercepts for each axis, and we'll be interested in the slope. Okay? So here, this endpoint, okay, 12, where does that come from? How is that connected to what we've already seen? Or what does that 12 mean?
12 shirts.
It's the number of shirts that what? 12 is the maximum number of shirts that Mexico can produce if they do what? If they devote all of their resources to shirts. We're assuming that each country has 24 units of labor. We're assuming in Mexico it takes 2 units of labor to produce 1 shirt. So if you're devoting 2 units of labor to each shirt, you got 24 units, the most shirts, maximum shirts you can produce would be 12. That's where that comes from. And the 2, okay, very similarly, we made an assumption in our previous slide that in Mexico it takes 12 units of labor to produce 1 computer. So if you got 24 units of labor, and it takes 12 units of labor for each computer, the most you can get, most computers you can get, you don't devote everything to computers, would be 2. Okay? And if you're devoting everything to computers, how many shirts are you going to get? You devote everything to computers, how many shirts are you going to get? You're going to get none. Okay. Okay. So if you remember from your algebra class, we describe any point in the graph we can describe with an ordered pair, which is the horizontal coordinate and the vertical coordinate. So the ordered pair describing that point would be 0 and 2. Okay? If Mexico chooses to produce devote everything to computers, then they're going to get 0 shirts. They're going to get 2 computers. This point is telling you they devote everything to shirts. Okay? Well, what's the ordered pair there? They're getting 12 shirts and how many computers? 0. Okay? So those are the 2 endpoints. And of course, they can devote some resources to labor and some to computers. And if they split it up like that, then they're going to end up somewhere on that production possibilities frontier. Once we know the 2 endpoints, then we can just draw the line between the 2. Okay? The slope of that frontier is very important. We won't be talking a lot about slope in this class, but definitely something you have to understand. What's the definition for slope? A rise over the run.
Rise over run.
Right. The change in the vertical variable over the change in the horizontal variable. Okay? So when we go from this point to that point, the change in computers is 2. And when we go from here to there, the change in shirts is 12. And actually this is negative because as you're going from here to there, that's a minus 2. So the slope would be minus 1/6. Okay? The negative is telling you that there's a trade-off. If you want more of one thing, you've got to give up some of the other good. Okay? The slope is the absolute value of the slope. Okay? 1/6 is a really useful number. Okay? And this will give you the answer to probably multiple questions on the exam. The slope of the production frontier gives you the opportunity cost of producing the good on the horizontal axis. Okay? Say that again, because it's very useful to remember. It's kind of a shortcut. The slope of the production frontier gives you the opportunity cost of producing the good on the horizontal axis. So since the slope is minus 1/6, we would say the opportunity cost of producing a shirt in Mexico is 1/6 of what? What are you giving up in Mexico when you produce shirts? You're giving up computers. So the opportunity cost of producing one shirt in Mexico would be 1/6 of a computer. For the United States, you do exactly the same thing. And you want to look at that graph and make sure it makes sense to you. Look at the endpoint there. One way to test yourself to find out, do I really understand this, is to explain it to yourself or to somebody else. Take a graph, find your roommate, say, I'm going to explain this to you. It doesn't matter if they understand it or not. If you can explain it, that's a good sign. If you can't explain it, that's a sign you need to do more work on it. Okay? So the endpoint here, say, well, this point means that in the United States, if we devote all of our resources to producing shirts, the most shirts we can get is 24. Okay? And what is the ordered pair that identifies that endpoint?
0, 24.
Be 0, or actually be 24 and 0, okay? Because if we choose to produce 24 shirts, we are choosing to produce no computers. Likewise, if we go the other extreme and we say, okay, let's devote everything to computers, then since we're assuming that one computer requires 1 unit of labor in the United States, that means we can produce 24 computers. But if we're devoting everything to computers, we're devoting nothing to shirts, so we get no shirt production. And so that ordered pair would be 0 and 24. Okay? So what is the slope of the United States production frontier?
0. 1.
It's going to be, right, it's going to be minus 1, okay? Because just using these 2 points, when we go from one extreme to the other, we're giving up 24 computers in order to get 24 shirts. 24 divided by 24 would be 1. And there's a trade-off. We're getting more shirts, but we're giving up computers. So the slope would actually be minus 1. And the absolute value of that slope, 1, represents the opportunity cost of producing shirts in the United States. Okay? So, why do we care about all that? We care about it because we're very interested in figuring out who has the comparative advantage in each good. What does it mean to have the comparative advantage? It means you can produce it at a lower opportunity cost. Who can produce shirts at a lower opportunity cost? Mexico. Mexico can, because remember, the opportunity cost of producing shirts in Mexico is 1/6 of a computer. The opportunity cost of producing shirts in the United States is 1 computer. 1/6 is definitely less than 1. So we would say that Mexico has the comparative advantage in producing shirts. Okay? And there's a very simple way. I guarantee there'll be questions where you have to figure out who has the comparative advantage in something. And there's a very simple way to just look at the graph and figure out without even having to do calculations. Comparative advantage is all about opportunity cost. And remember, the production frontier, or the slope of the frontier, gives you the opportunity cost of producing what? Which good? Production frontier always the slope gives you the opportunity cost of producing the good on the horizontal axis. Okay? So when you look at these two frontiers, clearly the frontier in Mexico is flatter than the one in the United States. Flatter means lower, the slope is less, which means lower opportunity cost. So what you can do, you can look at these two graphs and say, since the frontier in Mexico is flatter, that means the opportunity cost of producing the good on the horizontal axis is lower. And so that means that Mexico has the comparative advantage in producing that good. Right? That's a little complicated, but if you remember it, it really will help you in a lot of different kinds of problems. Let me state it again. When you want to know who has a comparative advantage in a particular good, okay, look at the production frontier. Okay? And the frontier that is flatter, that means that country has a comparative advantage in producing the good on the horizontal axis. Now, what if I ask you about computers? Okay? It's not on the horizontal axis. Okay? Well, here's the really useful shortcut. If Mexico has the comparative advantage in producing shirts, the United States will definitely have the comparative advantage in producing the other good. Okay? Now, we could go through the numbers and demonstrate that, but that gets even more complicated. Okay? So what you can do when you're looking at a situation like this, okay, look at the good on the horizontal axis. Okay? Say whose frontier is flatter. That country has the comparative advantage in the good on the horizontal axis. The other country has the comparative advantage in the other good. Okay? And when on the exam, questions will be such that if you use that, what I just gave you, you'll be able to draw conclusions. So you can focus on the slope of that frontier. Okay? And if you remember that, understand that kind of shortcut, that will enable you to answer those questions. Questions here. We're not finished with this, but questions at this point. Okay. And I would say, I've said before, this comparative advantage is one of the things that people tend to find most difficult in economics. So if it seems difficult to, it'll get better. Okay, this is just kind of a summary. To benefit from trade, a country doesn't need to have an absolute advantage. A country can benefit from trade if it has a comparative advantage. Okay? And one country will have a comparative, in a situation like this, two countries, two goods, then one country will have a comparative advantage in one, the other country will have the comparative advantage in the other. Now to demonstrate the benefits from trade based on comparative advantage, we're going to make an assumption. We've just said that Mexico has the comparative advantage in shirts. So let's assume they specialize in that. And we're going to assume that the U.S. specializes in what they have a comparative advantage in, computers. And when you specialize, then you have to trade. At what rate will computers trade for shirts? Okay? That's something we can't figure out what will actually happen. You have to have more information. But we're going to make an assumption. Again, we make lots of assumptions. And what we're going to be able to show is that if these two countries specialize in the way we are suggesting, and if they trade at this rate of 3 shirts for 1 computer, we will be able to show that both countries are going to benefit. All right. So here we have, this looks familiar, but it's got a little bit more to it. We've got Mexico's frontier, we've got the United States frontier. We're going to make an assumption that if these countries cannot trade with each other, if they're totally separate, they can't specialize, they can't trade, we're going to assume that Mexico would choose to produce right there. It's clearly possible for them to do that, okay? Because that is on their production frontier. And that point would be, if they're choosing to produce there, then what would be the ordered pair describing that point? 6 and 1. So if Mexico doesn't trade with anybody else, they can have 6 shirts, they can have 1 computer. We're going to make an assumption for the United States that let's see, just a second. That with no trade, right there, and it looks like with no trade, we're going to get, in the U.S., going to have 12 shirts produced, and we're going to have 12 computers produced. Okay? So those 2 points that we've identified, these are the combinations that will be, if they can't trade, we're assuming they would be producing 6 and 1 in Mexico, 12 and 12 in the United States. That's what they're producing. Next thing to think about, in Mexico, if they're producing 6 and 1, and if there's no trade, how much are they going to be consuming? If they're producing 6 and 1, and there's no trade, they're going to be consuming 6 and 1. If you don't trade, then you only get to consume what you produce. Okay? Without trade, Mexico has to operate, has to consume somewhere on that frontier, because that frontier is showing you what they are able to produce. They may want to produce somewhere out here, but without trade, they cannot go outside They cannot produce outside that frontier. Likewise over here. Without trade, they cannot produce outside that frontier, and so they cannot consume outside that frontier. So if they wanted to consume or produce out here, can't do it without trade. Does trade shift the frontier? Trade benefits both societies, but it doesn't change what they can produce. Okay? In Mexico, they can produce anywhere on that frontier they want. In the United States, we can produce anywhere on this frontier. Notice what happens when we have specialization and trade. Let's assume that the rate of trade is going to be 3 shirts for 1 computer. Okay? Now, that's not something we can prove is going to happen. We're saying assume that that's the rate at which trade is going to occur. Okay? And based on that assumption, we're about to see how trade, based on comparative advantage, will benefit everybody. Okay? In Mexico, if they specialize in shirts, then rather than producing here, they're going to go all the way over to there. That's production with trade. Devoting everything to shirt production. So they don't produce any computers because they don't have a comparative advantage in that. Okay? So they're now going to produce 12 computers or shirts, 0 computers. In the United States, it's a little bit more complicated. We said that the United States has a comparative advantage in computers, so we're going to specialize in computers. We're going to produce more computers than we otherwise would, but if the U.S. devoted all of its resources to computers, you get more computers than people want. Okay? So you're not, in this example, you're not going to have complete specialization in the United States. We're just having a movement toward more computer production, less shirt production. So in the U.S., whereas without trade we were producing here, now we're going to move to that green point. Okay? And that green point is what? The green point is 14 or 10 and 14. Now, keep in mind on the exam, I'm not going to require you to be able to go through all of this, but it's really important that you see it so that when we get to the conclusion, you will appreciate the significance of it. Okay? The U.S., they're moving towards specialization in computers because they have a comparative advantage in that they're going to produce at 10 and 14. In Mexico, they're producing at 12 and 0. Okay? Now, so that's how they're going to produce. Okay? Now they're going to trade 3 shirts for 1 computer. Okay? And so in Mexico, they're going to give up They're going to give up 3 shirts, and they're going to get 1 computer. Okay. So if you start out with 12 shirts and you give up 3, you end up with 9. They've traded those shirts and they get 1 computer. So we end up there with 9 shirts and 1 computer. Okay. Notice what's happened. We said the production frontier limits what the country can produce. Now, without trade, you can't produce, you can't consume outside that frontier. But what we see here is it looks like Mexico is going to be able to consume at a point above their frontier. So clearly, Mexico is going to be better off because they specialized and then they traded. A lot of people would look at that and say, well, yeah, they're going to benefit. But that just shows that we're going to be hurt. They're gaining, so we must be losing. Okay? And that would be exactly right if trade was a zero-sum game. It's a positive-sum game. And now we can demonstrate that that is the case because in the U.S., we're now producing at 10 and 14. Okay? We're going to give our trade. Mexico is now going to get one of our computers. So our computer consumption is going to go down to 13. We've produced 14. We're trading one away, so we end up with 13. In terms of shirts, we produced 10. We traded and we got 3 more. So we end up with 13 shirts and 13 computers, which is this point. Notice the consumption with trade point is above the production frontier. Because of comparative advantage in trade, the U.S. is able to consume more than it is able to produce. And Mexico, because of trade, is able to consume more than it produces. Both countries are able to produce or to consume above their production frontiers. It's like magic, right? That we can have more than we produced, and they can have more than they produced. And it seems like, well, how could that can't be? But we just went through it. We may have had a little difficulty following the math, but we just went through it. And we see that everybody benefits. The whole point of this is that when people or when countries specialize in the product with which or at which they have a comparative advantage and then they trade, everybody is benefiting. There doesn't have to be a loser. There won't be a loser unless somebody is breaking the rules and violating, not giving the other party what they had promised. And this is a conclusion that is extremely important because it means that when we look at other countries and we see we're trading with them, they're really gaining from trading with us, and somebody says, well, we should stop doing it because we're losing. We should remember these graphs and say the fact that they are benefiting does not mean we're losing. It's great that they're benefiting from trading with us. That means they will want to keep doing it. And the more they trade with us, the more they will benefit and the more we will benefit. Trade is mutually beneficial. I will say that over and over and over because it is so important in terms of the policies that the trade policies a government will follow, but also in terms of wars. If you think another country is hurting you, then you're more likely to attack them than if you think that you're benefiting from trading with them. Trade is mutually beneficial. If each country specializes in what they have a comparative advantage in, then everybody is going to benefit. It is one of those conclusions in economics that has enormous implications for how a country should deal with other countries. Any questions about any of that? Like I said, I won't give you some of the sapling questions dealing with trade get rather complicated. I won't give you questions on the exam that are extremely complicated. We'll need to be able to look at information about two countries, look at a production frontier, figure out what is the opportunity cost of each to produce one product or the other product. We need to be able to figure out who has the comparative advantage in each product, who has the absolute advantage in each product, which country should produce a certain product, which should produce the other product. Okay? All right, that's more than enough for chapter 2. Chapter 3, give me just a second. Okay, chapter 3 is on supply and demand. Supply and demand is a framework that we will be using throughout the whole course. Whereas comparative advantage, that's an important idea that you need to understand, but we won't really do a whole lot with it after chapter 2. Chapter 3 is something that we will be using for the rest of the semester. So it's really important to understand this framework. And the book and sapling give you a lot of very useful information about how to think about supply and demand and how to use it. Okay? What I want to do in the time we have left today is kind of talk about the big picture. Okay? Don't think of supply and demand as just a bunch of curves you have to understand. Okay? Let's think about the big picture. We have said that we all face scarcity. As a result, we have to make choices. We said there are different ways that society can make those choices. You can have more of a socialist system where the government makes most of the choices, or you can have a market economy where private individuals, private businesses get to make their own choices about how they use the resources that belong to them. And so you could say in chapter 3 and chapter 4, we are developing a framework that helps us understand how things work in a market economy. We said that market economy, everybody gets to do pretty much what they want. Okay? There are rules, there are laws. You have to follow the rules. Okay? But as long as you follow the rules, you get to do whatever you want. Nobody tells you you have to go to school and become an engineer, or nobody tells a company you have to produce aluminum. Everybody gets to make their own choices, and we like that idea of freedom, getting to do what we want. But think about this: what is the population of the U.S.? Last time I checked, I think it's around 320 million people. Okay? Ask a question. How can you have 320 million people all doing their own thing, nobody telling them what to do? Okay? How can you have that without it ending up in chaos? Don't you have to have somebody making the decisions and saying, we need doctors, you've got to be a doctor. We need milk, you've got to be a milk producer. How can we have 320 million people, everybody doing their own thing, without it leading to chaos? A lot of people would say, I don't know. That's a good question. A lot of people look at that question and they say, That's right. We need government to play a bigger role. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 deal with this question. If everybody gets to make their own decisions, what is the outcome going to be? And you could kind of summarize the conclusion we're going to reach by saying this. We do not have, it is true that we do have to have some kind of coordination. We do not have to have a coordinator. We don't have to have somebody sitting in Washington telling everybody what to do. We do have to have some kind of coordination. And you could say that we have, in a market economy, we have a coordinating mechanism. Our coordination as to what people can produce, what they can consume, doesn't come from an individual giving orders as it does under a socialist or command economy. The coordination comes from a mechanism, and that mechanism is called the price mechanism. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 are all about how prices are determined. You may think of the price of a good, bacon or eggs or gas. You may think of it as kind of just being, well, they just charge whatever they want. That's not really the way it works. We're going to see that prices are extremely important. And prices, for the most part, are pretty much out of the hands of individual producers and individual consumers. Okay? And you'll see what I mean by that as we go along. To understand, let's see here. Just a second. Understand to understand supply and demand, to understand how a market economy works, we have to go back to a person I have alluded to several times before, Adam Smith. And if you've heard much about Adam Smith outside of this class, there's a good chance that what you heard was not correct. There's a lot of things get said about Adam Smith that are not really true. Right? Adam Smith is important because he was the first person to really give a pretty good explanation of how things work in a market economy. And even though he lived in the 18th century, in many ways, nobody has done a better job of explaining how it works. In 1776, Adam Smith published a book that was extremely influential. He was first let's talk about who he was. He was a Scottish philosopher. He wasn't really considered an economist, even though today he is considered the father of economics, but he was a philosopher. He taught in colleges about morality. That's what he did. Right? But he was, more than anything else, he was a thinker. He looked at the world and he tried to understand, why do things work the way they work? He was born in 1723, and in 1776 he published one of two books that he is known for, and the title is Wealth of Nations. And there won't be a whole lot of dates and names you'll have to remember in this course, but this is one you do need to remember. Adam Smith, 1776, The Wealth of Nations. That's not the full title of the book. Okay? You don't have to remember the full title. You need to remember this. But it's useful to think about the full title, because the full title was an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. He was asking the question, what is wealth? And then secondly, what is the cause of wealth? Notice he's asking a question that it's very different from what people often ask today. People see someone in poverty or a country in poverty and they say, well, what causes that? Adam Smith would say, well, poverty is caused by scarcity. You don't start out having lots of stuff. He would say the important thing to ask is, how is it that some people in some countries escape poverty? Poverty is the natural condition, but not everybody, every country remains in it. So what are the means by which people and countries are able to escape poverty? He was very interested in those questions, and he was challenging the prevailing views of his day. The prevailing view was called mercantilism. He argued that the mercantilists were wrong about what wealth was, and that they were wrong about how wealth was produced. The mercantilist idea was that, and some of this will sound very familiar to you if you watch the news. The mercantilists believed that wealth was basically gold and silver, precious metals. Okay? So if somebody, for a country to be wealthy, needs to have a lot of gold and silver. If you don't have much gold and silver, you're not wealthy. Adam Smith said, well, that's not really the right way to look at it. He said a country is wealthy if they have the ability for people to have the goods and services they want. If you have a society where people can have good food, good clothing, good education, things like that, that is a wealthy society. They're going to have a high standard of living. How much gold and silver they have, that's kind of beside the point. You have a society with lots of gold and silver, but they don't have the ability to produce food and clothing and necessities for people. He'd say that's not a wealthy society, no matter how much gold and silver they have. So Smith is saying their focus was wrong. They were focusing on gold and silver, money, basically, because that's what was used as money, rather than on what money is used to buy the things that people value. So Smith is saying the mercantilists were fundamentally wrong about what wealth was. Secondly, he said they were fundamentally wrong about how a country could become prosperous. Mercantilists believed that to become prosperous, what you had to do was make sure that your country has lots of gold and silver. So the government needs to follow policies that will ensure that gold and silver comes into the country and ensure that it doesn't go out of the country. And one part of that, they believed that it was good for the country to encourage exports, good for the country's businesses to sell things to other countries. Okay? But it was bad to import things. Okay? There are a lot of mercantilists in the Trump administration. Okay? They tend to think that exports are good, imports are bad. Okay? Smith would say, no, that's not true. Okay? But the mercantilists believed that, so they wanted to encourage exports, discourage imports, and they believed to accomplish this objective, well, it's like the economy is kind of like a ship. And the destination you want the ship to reach is prosperity. Well, if you want the country to get to that destination, you have to have somebody at the helm. You have to have somebody guiding the economy to the right outcome, which meant they believed you needed government to make big decisions about what should be produced and how much should be consumed. Adam Smith said, no, wrong again. Okay? He argued that if you want the country to be prosperous, then primarily there are some things government needs to do. He believed the government needs to should establish a framework of laws. Government should have police. Government should provide for national defense. He said, if you want the country to be prosperous, after the government says, here are the rules, don't break the rules, the government should then say, with your property, do whatever you want. Decide what you think is good, and then do it. And the phrase he is known for is the invisible hand. He said, if the government will allow people to engage in pretty much unregulated free trade, let them do what they think is best for them individually. He said, it's as if there's this hand that you can't see that will push them to produce those things that are most highly valued by others. In other words, each person is likely to be doing what they think is best for them, but they end up unintentionally producing the things that are, in a sense, best for society as a whole. You don't need government telling them what to do. Government enforces the rules and then says, do whatever you want. How can that possibly work? Well, chapter 3 and chapter 4 will help us understand that the invisible hand is really the price mechanism. And if you understand the price mechanism well, then you will have understood the most important thing that you need to know from this course. So that's what we will continue with next time. Chapter 3 and chapter 4, they really go together. Okay? So be working on that. Oh, as far as the exam, the room I thought we could move to, it looks like it's still being used, so we can't do that. But I have processed most of the emails I received from you, and I can pretty much say that for everybody who has sent me an email, it looks like you will be able to take your exam at the time you said you would like to take it. Okay? If you haven't sent me an email, you need to do that right away. Okay? Because I think it's going to be okay for everybody, the whole class, to be able to take it when they want to take it. But I can't say that for sure until I get the rest of the emails. I will be sending out tonight a page that will list everybody's name and the time that I'm expecting you to take it. And at this point, it looks like everybody will be able to take it when they want to take it. Let me know if you have questions.
So this is my first time in class in person because Marty, remember I emailed you?
Yeah.
I just got back last Friday.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out